Well, let's talk now a little bit about, with regard to these quotations, variations in quotations and the wording of the quote in the New Testament. So there are different categories we're going to discuss a little bit. And the first one that we have a number of points on is the fact that when a quote was made from the Old Testament to the New Testament, by the authors in the New Testament, sometimes there were variations in grammar. So we're going to do a quick summary of these in a sense. And the point, though, is that this kind of variation does not in any way affect the main thought or point of the verse from the Old Testament to the New. It doesn't change any theological issues. They do not affect doctrine or really the verbal inspiration of the Scriptures as we talk about these kinds of variations we're going to bring up right now. First, the New Testament writers sometimes, and you'll see it's not critical, they're not critical issues. The New Testament writers sometimes substituted a pronoun for a noun. When Matthew quoted Isaiah 43, "Make straight in the wilderness the highway for our God," he wrote, "Make straight paths for him," substituting him for our God. No essential issue with that or change of the meaning of the Old Testament text at all. Nouns, number two, nouns were sometimes used in place of pronouns, just the reverse. For example, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." Luke 19:38 makes more specific the words of Psalm 118:26. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." 3, a plural noun is sometimes used in place of a singular noun. Matthew referred to Jesus speaking in parables, but he quoted Psalm 78:2, which had a singular idea of parable in it. So that's not, these are not major issues in terms of these quotes. Sometimes writers changed a pronoun. Isaiah said the virgin will call him, virgin is mentioned in Isaiah 7:14, will call him Emmanuel. When Matthew quoted the verse, he said they will call him Emmanuel. Both are obviously true. The virgin named him Emmanuel, and others will call him by the same name, that type of thing. Occasionally, number 5, a speaker is identified in the quotation. John the Baptist quoted Isaiah 40, verse 3, but included it in the fact that he was the one Isaiah referred to himself. Isaiah spoke of a voice of one calling in the desert, "Prepare the way for the Lord," whereas John said in the response to a question by the religious leaders about his identity, "I am the voice of one calling in the desert." Obviously, he needed to alter the quotation slightly to answer their question. Number 6, sometimes direct discourse is changed to indirect discourse. Direct discourse would be a first person I talking to a second person you. Indirect discourse is a first person speaking to a third person, he, she, or it. This is seen in Hosea 2:23. "I will say to those called not my people, you are my people," which is quoted in Romans 9:25. "I will call them my people who are not my people." So we went from a second person to a third person idea, from you to them. Okay. The opposite is also true. Indirect discourse is changed to direct discourse. Number 8, the verbal form is sometimes altered slightly. The commands beginning with the words "you shall not" in Exodus 20:13 through 16 are changed to the imperative "do not" in Mark 10:19 regarding the Passover lambs. The Lord instructed the people, "Do not break any of the bones." When John applied this to Jesus, he changed the imperative to an indicative statement, Not one of his bones will be broken. He's seeing the fulfillment in Christ, the correspondence, the type, the antitype with regard to the Passover lamb in its application to Christ. Number 9, a general reference occasionally will be made more specific in the New Testament quotations. That happens, like in Amos 5:26, refers to the shrine of your king, the star of your God. When Stephen quoted this in Acts 7:43, he referred to the shrine of Molech and the star of your God, Rephan. So he gives this more specifics. Same idea, though. Same idea. Sometimes, here's a 10th point, sometimes the extent of the reference is changed. For example, in Amos 5:27, it referred to exile beyond Damascus, but Stephen, in giving the history of Israel, extended it to refer exile beyond Babylon. Okay, same idea, but the extent is changed of the reference. The order of the clauses is sometimes rearranged. That happens. Sometimes two quotations are combined and assigned to the more prominent of the two Old Testament authors. You can see this in Mark chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, where we have this happen. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And he says, Mark says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way before you, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord. Okay? And so we have Isaiah quoted there, but the first part, verse 2, is from the book of Malachi. Okay? But so the quote is attributed to the more prominent of the two prophets, but it comes from the prophets. That's what's going on there. And finally, sometimes in the New Testament, writers rendered the sense of the Old Testament passage loosely, or they paraphrased it, just like we do today. And a paraphrase of an Old Testament idea that doesn't change at all the meaning of the text that's paraphrased is a legitimate way to bring the Old Testament into the New. It doesn't affect inspiration or inerrancy when that happens. We've talked about that in our previous classes.